This video, what I really want to do, and this is kind of a two-part video, I want to talk about the people that Jesus is interacting with and sort of the classes and the different groups that Jesus encounters in the book of John and in the Gospels, more generally speaking. And so in this one, what I want to talk about is first, I want to talk about the temple leaders or the chief priests. And then I want to talk about just the people on the ground and how you can conceive of sort of the social strata and the breaking up of different groups once we move out of the more specific group of the chief priests and the temple leaders. And then in the other video that's kind of a part of this pair of videos is going to go in depth just in the Pharisees, a really important group of people that you have probably heard a lot about before, but maybe you haven't actually dug into the history of them, and it's possible to get some stereotypes of that group of people, actually, too. Some sort of like shallow readings of who they are. And so, if you haven't watched that video yet, when you're done with this one, run and check that one out as well. I think you'll really enjoy that one. So let's dig into it. The first group of people I want to talk about are the temple leaders or the chief priests. They're a really important group of people in the book of John, and we actually get to hear some of the names of some of these people even later on in the book when Jesus is going about his trial and crucifixion. We learn a little bit about the dynamics of this group in John, and actually. John himself, there's some speculation that the author, John, who clearly, and we talked about this in another one of these videos, clearly has a really good understanding of the world that he's writing about, the world that Jesus is walking around in. He's very clear, he's intimately connected to it. There's some speculation that John himself was actually a member of the high priestly family because of some of the access that he has later in the book and how he knows what's going on behind closed doors. It seems like he follows Jesus into the trial and the other disciples aren't able to follow him in there. And there's a lot of scholarly speculation that the reason John's able to do it is because he's actually a part of that family. So who are these people? The chief priests, the temple leaders. Well, in all senses of the word, among Jewish people, they're the real power in the world. They hold the political power and the theological power in the world of first century Judaism. And those two things, we separate them out. We would talk about like a political leader as not being the same as a theological leader. That'd be like talking about a senator or a congressman or woman and a pastor, right? Or a bishop or something like that. We talk about those two things as totally separate positions, not having anything to do with one another. But actually, if you're living in the first century, those two things are actually kind of squished together. And the reason is because the temple plays such an important political role in the life of a first century Jewish person that the leaders of the temple, who exercise this sort of theological authority, end up exercising a lot of what we would call political authority. And for those people, breaking those two up would seem weird. For us, it's weird to put them together, but we kind of have to understand that we're living in a totally different sort of cultural context than what they are. And so even though it seems weird to us, it still is important that we try to approach it on its own terms. So the real power in the land is this group of people. And that doesn't include the Romans, of course. The Romans exercise even more power, sort of say so, in the day-to-day life of a Jewish person if they want to, because they have the armies to do it. And it's technically their territory. And so you have governors like Pontius Pilate, who kind of oversees the region. And King Herod is another one of those people who oversees the region on behalf of Rome and report directly to Caesar himself. But they work closely with this Jewish group of people, the chief priests and the temple leaders, because they're the ones who sort of mediate the people, represent the people to the Roman authorities. And so it's important for both of these groups of people to be working together to sort of oversee the first century world of a Jewish person together. And so there's a kind of an interesting part in the book of John, in John 18:14, where Caiaphas, who is the high priest at the time, he's the person we learn is kind of the chief priest, the head of all of the priests, and kind of one of the main, if not the main, political authority, who's a Jewish person in the area. He says that it's good for the one man to die for the people. And what he's actually saying there is that, listen, in order to keep the peace here, we're afraid that this Jesus character, because of his claims that he's making to be the Messiah, to be the promised king to come from Israel, he's going to cause some trouble for us on the Roman part of things, because they might not like it that some, in their mind, wannabe king is running around making claims that he's come from God to establish God's kingdom. And so it would be better off for all the people if we stopped Rome from coming in and making a mess of things by killing him. And John kind of talks about it as if it's a prophetic point that Caiaphas didn't understand, that yes, Jesus is actually dying for the people, but to save them, but not in the way that Caiaphas might think. But you see Caiaphas sort of operating in that role of sort of mediating or representing the people to the Roman authorities and trying to kind of work between the two. The people who make up the chief priests or the temple authorities are a tight-knit group of families who are really, and that's really controlled and regulated and sort of kept all in the family. And so we even see this. Caiaphas is the high priest in the year that Jesus goes to trial before him, but actually the one who we find out actually is kind of pulling the strings behind Caiaphas is his father-in-law, a guy named Annas, who was apparently the high priest at an earlier time, but had sort of given up his what's the word I'm thinking of? His term limit or something like that, like we might think of. He'd run out of that, but he kind of kept the power behind the scenes, moving the puppet strings of his son Caiaphas. So now, there's not necessarily any ancestral claims. The high priests don't necessarily have to be plugged into the Levitical sacrificial system. They don't have to have come from the line of David or anything like that. They've actually, we find, they've been kind of put in the place that they are by Herod and his family, or people in his kind of political party, or the Romans. They kind of carefully have chosen these families because they think these families are people they can kind of keep in line. Most of the chief priests, and we don't see this word show up in the book of John, but if you read through the other Gospels, you will see this, or the book of Acts, you'll see the word Sadducees come up. The Sadducees are sort of, and watch the Pharisee video to kind of get a sense for maybe the understanding of what we maybe think of as parties, political parties almost. But the Sadducees tend to be a party that the chief priests are typically a part of. And this is a real, and we don't actually know that much about the Sadducees. We know more about the Pharisees. But it seems like they are concerned with kind of keeping themselves in power. They're more conservative, not in the sense we use, but they want to keep things conservative in the sense that they want to just kind of keep the status quo, keep things the way that they are. They don't want things to change because that would mean their power is going to kind of leave them. And we find out that even in other parts of Scripture that they actually, or other Gospels tell us that the Sadducees didn't actually believe that all of what we call now the Old Testament, in their mind just the Hebrew Scriptures, they didn't believe that all of those were like inspired or authoritative. The only ones that they really looked to sort of ground that for them were the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Pentateuch is what we call it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we find out that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which would mean a lot of the chief priests, don't really get along that well. They tend to get in a lot of conflict. There's a kind of an interesting or funny story in Acts in chapter 22 where Paul is on, he's caused some trouble. A lot of it's been manufactured, actually. He's not actually causing any trouble, but he's kind of in a trial setting before the chief priests at the time, and there are some Pharisees in the room too, because the Pharisees hold a certain type of power, which I'll talk about a little bit in that other or in that video on the Pharisees more specifically. But they're in the room together, and Paul's like, "I got to get out of this situation," and so what he does is he says, I was about preaching the resurrection from the dead, and he means specifically Jesus and our hope as those who are in Jesus of being resurrected someday. But what happens is because the Pharisees, we know a big part of their belief is the resurrection of the dead, and the Sadducees were very much against the belief of the resurrection of the dead, that it actually causes a big fight between them. The Pharisees, who originally had been kind of against Paul, are like, well, this guy Paul is kind of on our side on this issue, and so we got to kind of defend him, I guess, because we find out it was such a big flashpoint for the Pharisees and Sadducees arguing over the resurrection that like Paul's able to get out of some trouble by kind of pitting these two groups who had been united against him against each other and kind of dividing them. So it's kind of an interesting episode, but it actually shows us a lot of the dynamics of kind of the political and like theological world of the day. Why would the Sadducees or the chief priests not often believe in resurrection? Like I said, we don't know a ton about them, but it actually makes a lot of practical sense because that would mean they could get away with doing a lot of their stuff and not have to worry about any sort of judgment down the road. They could worry about power and keeping that in the present time and not worry so much about God judging them for that someday in the resurrection. Okay? All right, so that's the temple leaders, the chief priests, and sort of the kind of the real power brokers in the book of John, aside from Pilate, the Roman governor, at least in terms of in a Jewish sense. Let's just talk for a little bit about the day-to-day life of, or sort of like life on the ground for the regular people. We know that there were few rich people in ancient Palestine. And many poor people. And typically, when you get into towns, you're dealing with a little bit richer people, if not very rich people. And when you get out into the countryside, you're seeing the much more poor people pop up. And it kind of, I think we can talk about it in terms of like, it's kind of similar to us. We have like the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. It seems like there was that in the ancient Jewish world as well in first century. You have the rich who are like the high priestly families, and then the rich landowners. So the high priestly families were, kind of wrapped into these kind of, several few families who kind of, throw power back and forth to one another. They have a lot of power. We find out in some other sources that they own lots of food or grain or whatever. And so there's even a story where one family, a really rich family called the Gurian family, which actually Nicodemus, who we meet in chapter 3 of John, may have been a part of. There's some good evidence that he was a part of this family. But they are actually able to feed, like Jerusalem is holding out against the Roman armies who are kind of standing at their gates, and this family says, we'll feed everybody in the city. We have enough food to feed them for several years if we need to. So they're very rich. Like they can care for large amounts of people with their resources. And then you also have the rich landowners who own lots of the farmland. And this is a very different period in Israel's history, but the dynamics are not that different. If you remember back last summer, we walked through the book of Ruth, and Boaz is a pretty rich landowner. He owns a bunch of land and can do what he wants with it. And so guys like Boaz actually held a lot of power in the ancient world, in ancient Israel. Then you kind of have the middle class, which makes up some of the farmers, some of the fishermen, some of the artisans, maybe people who have specialized skills, like blacksmith or different things like that. Some of those just more specialized trades, but that they still are kind of maybe if they're a farmer, they're working land that belongs to another farm owner. If they're a fisherman, they're kind of selling their fish that they catch to the richer families. And then you get your lower class, and these are people who are like working in the fields, the people that you hire for like a day's worth of labor. There is stories that parables that Jesus will tell about a rich landowner who wants to hire some people to work for him for a day. The people who he's hiring for him to work for a day in that parable, if that parable rings a bell, that you've heard it before, would have been the poorest group of people, and they're just day to day looking for work and looking to make a wage so that they can have enough to put food in their belly and get up the next morning and do it all over again. We know debt is a major issue in the first century as well. Lots of people are in debt. to the rich landowners and the other people who are like just gonna kind of help these poor people out, but really they're helping them out by putting them into more debt, and it's not really a great system. We know that's actually a really big problem, and some of Jesus's parables actually deal with this issue. In the book of John, Jesus doesn't actually tell any parables. It's a different kind of way of telling the story of Jesus that doesn't use parables, but if you read them in the other Gospels, then you hear that. Ancient Jewish people are not really concerned with the question of how do I get to heaven when I die. That's like a misconception that we have kind of put on the ancient Jewish person. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when I get to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are kind of a group of grassroots, like a grassroots sort of like organization who's kind of growing up and is trying to kind of get the people concerned about certain things that they think matter, that are again both political and theological. But most people day to day are just kind of worried about the biggest problem that they have. The way that they want God to move is to liberate them from the Roman oppression. They think God is going to act to save them when he shows up to undo the oppression that they're under from Rome. And so that's what they're concerned with. That's what they're praying for. And they don't really have a good, like, sort of theology around probably where that's coming from. They're not sitting around thinking about theology. They don't have the luxury of doing that. They're trying to scrape by day after day. And so they're just kind of hoping for that. They have some knowledge of the Messiah. You would have rabbis who would go around and teach about this. But, we'll see in the book, there's not even consensus among, like, regular, everyday townsfolk about what the Messiah is going to look like when he shows up. So this is kind of like the big concern for a lot of people, just getting by. I don't think that there's a lot. I mean, when we think about it that way, like, there is a lot of distance and cultural distance and obviously chronological distance between us and people living in the first century. But in a lot of ways, they're not that different from people who live in our society as well. And it's good for us to kind of put ourselves into their shoes, or to think about what Jesus might be saying to them from that standpoint, because that's the stuff they're concerned with when Jesus shows up to them. And Jesus is speaking into that context. He's saying stuff that is not what they expect, and he is for sure is tying them into a deeper spiritual reality, and by what he means when he talks about the kingdom of God coming, when he talks about the love of God coming to them, when he talks about salvation and belief and his work, his work to deliver them. But he is speaking to those needs, and so it's kind of important for us to have a good understanding of that. So that's kind of a 30. I still am not going into a ton of depth there, but it gives you kind of a good understanding, hopefully, of what it looks like to have boots on the ground in that time and place in which Jesus is doing his ministry, and as we read through it in the book of John.